It's not fair. Ever heard that? Hear it a lot from children, don't you? It's not fair. Now, I don't mean I've got something my brother hasn't got. I mean, he's got more than me. Funny how it's only one way round that we seem to recognise what's unfair. But it's often the way in life, isn't it? Things aren't fair. Have you ever suffered for doing what is right? Maybe you're mocked because you won't cheat. You won't join other people in victimising someone who's different. You spend a lot of time, effort, planning special times for the family. And what's the response? Nothing. No thanks, no gratitude. All your love and effort disappears into a black hole of silence. Or perhaps you put a lot of effort into helping someone, and then your efforts are twisted and criticised. The person you did so much for spreads lies about you. Maybe you're despised, treated with contempt. What you say is dismissed as unimportant. Your wishes and feelings are disregarded. You're just stuck in a dead-end job. The only way to get promotion is to engage in unethical practices. How do you respond when these things happen to you? What do you do when you're treated unfairly? I'm going to get even with him. He made me suffer, I'll make sure he suffers. And you want to hit back. If you're a child, perhaps you hit back physically. When you're a bit older, you hit back with angry words. Or maybe you can't hit back. You know, if you told your boss what you thought of the way he treated you, you'd be out of a job. So you don't say anything to him. You just tell everybody else what a lousy boss he is. Take out your frustration by criticising him to others. Or perhaps you just clam up. You don't have anyone to tell about it, or you think they won't want to listen. So on the surface, you say nothing. Inside, you're seething. Your mind's inventing all kinds of tortures for this person who's wronged you. Maybe you even get angry with God. Why is he making me suffer like this? I deserve better than what's happening to me. There are common ways to respond, aren't they, to injustice, the natural reactions to being wronged. If I've been mistreated or let down or hurt, then the other person should be paid back. And I have the right to make sure that happens if I can. I can criticise them, I can slander them, I can use put-downs, threats, grudges, make sure they get their comeuppance. But how should we respond? Peter tells us this is commendable. What? If because of conscience towards God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. When you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. Notice how it's already broadened the topic. In verse 18, he was addressing household slaves. But in verse 19, it's anyone who endures grief suffering wrongfully. What do you do when you suffer wrongfully? You're to endure, to take it patiently. And what does that mean? One writer calls it courageous steadfastness in the midst of adversity. It's not putting up with ill treatment out of fear or cowardice, but you've got no choice. It's not a stoic resignation that simply refuses to bow your head to opposition. It's something that's based on conscience toward God, mindfulness of God. It's linked with being submissive rather than rebellious. That's not easy, is it? It's not our automatic, our default response to injustice. And so Peter doesn't just tell us what to do and leave it at that, get on with it. He tries to motivate us to do it. And he does that by pointing us to Christ. Not psychological manipulation, profound theology. Even if you're not suffering in any way at all, you can still use what he says. It's important, it's relevant to you, because he's telling you about your Lord. In verse 21, Peter gives us a fundamental principle. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Fundamental principle is this: we must copy Christ. We must do what he did. And Peter uses two expressions to make that clear. First, he says Christ left us an example. The word he uses comes from the field of education. When a child's learning to write, one of the exercises he does is to trace over letters. Maybe there's the outline of the letter on the page in faint dots, and he goes over it to learn how to shape the letter. A little later on, he's got a page with the letters on the top line, and he copies them underneath. That's the kind of picture that the word Peter's using. We're to copy Christ, trace his actions, just as the child copies the letters on the page. And then he uses a second term. He says we should follow Christ's steps. And perhaps a good way to think of that is the Christmas carol about Good King Wenceslas. You know that one? You know the story? Wenceslas looks out of his palace window on Boxing Day, the feast of St. Stephen. He sees a poor man gathering fuel, and he calls his page, asks where the man lives, tells the page to bring food and wine. Together they set out to bring help to the man. Page and monarch, forth they went together, through the cold wind's wild lament and the bitter weather. But soon the page is struggling. Sire, the night is darker now, and the wind blows stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how. I can go no longer. And what's Wenceslas's advice? Mark my footsteps, my good page. Tread now in them boldly. You shall find the winter's rage freeze your blood less coldly. In his master's steps he trod, where the snow lay dinted. Heat was in the very sod which the saint had printed. Now we don't have to believe in heated footprints to get the picture. There's the page carefully treading in the footsteps of his master. And that's the picture that Peter's giving us. To do what Christ did. To copy him. Follow him closely and carefully. Peter says that's your calling. To this you were called. Suffering, even unjust suffering, isn't an accident. It's not just fate or a curse. We're not helpless victims. Remember how in Isaiah 53, the servant was despised and rejected, suffered the death of a criminal, though he was totally innocent. But he wasn't a helpless victim of circumstances, the fierce opposition of his enemies. He freely chose to go to that ugly, unjust death. And we're called to follow him. It's not that God doesn't care about our suffering. It's not that he can't do anything about it. Far from it being outside God's plan, it's the very thing to which he's called us. And that's a crucial point. If you're called somewhere, who's doing the calling? It's the Lord of glory, the divine King of kings, who calls his people to endure their afflictions. So we can do that knowing that our circumstances are a result of his sovereign wisdom, his immeasurable love, his almighty power. The one who calls us to suffer won't allow those sufferings to ruin us. He'll bring great good out of them. Doesn't mean the sufferings themselves are good, but God will bring good out of them. And we are called then to suffer, just as Christ was called to suffer. Every Christian is called first to suffer with Christ, then to be glorified with him. And we may expect to be misunderstood, to be criticised, to be ignored, to be hurt for doing what's right. That's what happened to Jesus. And it will happen to his people. And we are to respond as Jesus did, to copy the way he acted. Here's our basic principle. We're to imitate Christ. And so the next question is obvious. How did Christ respond to unjust suffering? You may have seen the bracelets people used to wear, maybe still do, with the initials on them, WWJD. So for what would Jesus do? And the idea is that by answering that question, we know what we should do, because we're to do what Jesus would do. But of course that raises another question. How do we know what Jesus would do? It's very easy when there's something we want to do to say, well, yes, that's what Jesus would do in these circumstances. We can twist things. But the answer, I suggest, is that we change the initials to WDJD. What did Jesus do? Because it's what we see in the pages of Scripture that tell us what Christ really did do, and therefore what he would do in similar situations. As we look at Peter's answer to that question, what did Jesus do in the face of unjust suffering? Very obvious, he has Isaiah 53 in his mind. He quotes at least one verse directly. The whole passage lies behind what he says. That's what brought me to consider this subject for today, because it follows on from what we were looking at last month. And Peter tells us 4 things about how Christ responded to unjust suffering. 3 of them, what he didn't do, in fact. The first is that he didn't sin. And there Peter quotes Isaiah 53:9, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Now we saw from Isaiah 53 that expression meant that Christ pursued a positive policy of avoiding such conduct. It wasn't just that the occasion never arose, so it didn't happen. Same as if nobody provokes you, you don't get angry. It's not that kind of just not happening to sin. But it's that he deliberately had a policy of avoiding it. Nor was deceit found in his mouth. He never misled anyone. He prevailed through truth, not trickery. Totally guiltless in what he said, what he did. His outward conduct, his inward character. Not one iota of his suffering was his own fault. It was all unjust. He didn't do anything wrong to provoke it. There's nothing wrong in any point of his response to it. Can you say that? You think of the worst offence anyone ever committed against you. Was there absolutely nothing in you that provoked the attack? Maybe not. The old lady who's mugged in the street didn't provoke the assault. We do suffer evil that's not in any way our fault. But how do we respond to it? When you think of the worst injustice you ever suffered, can you honestly say there was nothing wrong in your response? That's a challenge for us. Christ did not sin when he suffered. Neither must we. And secondly, he didn't revile. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. He didn't retaliate. Think of all the slander Christ endured in his ministry. He was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. People said he cast out demons by the power of the devil. He was accused of even being demon-possessed. On the cross, he was reviled by the Jewish leaders, those who stood around, even by the criminals crucified beside him. But he didn't respond in kind. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, no, so he opened not his mouth. Neither the Jewish council, nor Pilate, nor Herod could provoke him into responding to the insults. Even on the cross, he made no response to the taunts of his enemies. When you're tempted to retaliate, remember Christ's example. You must not revile other people. You must not trade insults. That includes what you say about them to other people. You must guard your tongue, the way you speak. There's a hymn that Don Carson wrote. I am ashamed, O Lord, forgive. I used to nurture bitterness, to count up every slight. The world's a moral wilderness, and I have felt its blight. Self-pity ruled, resentment reigned, and no one understood my pain. I spiraled down in murky night, insisting that I had the right to hate and hate again. I am ashamed. O Lord, forgive. But then the gospel taught me how to contemplate the cross, for there Christ died for me, and now I've glimpsed the bitter cost. He bore abuse and blows and hate, but he did not retaliate. Triumphant malice sneered and tossed blind rage at him. He never lost the love that conquers hate. I am ashamed. O Lord, forgive. To make no threat, to smile, forgive, to love despite the cost. For Jesus showed me how to live and trust the one who's just, to suffer wrong and feel the pain, while certain that the loss is gain. Oh God, I want so much to trust, to follow Jesus on the cross, to love and love again. Christ didn't sin. He didn't retaliate and revile. Then thirdly, he didn't threaten. When he suffered, he did not threaten. Do you remember his words in Gethsemane? Do you think I cannot now pray to my Father? He will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels. He had the power to destroy those who caused his pain. He didn't use that power. Perhaps you also have the power to destroy or at least damage the person who hurt you. You could spread tales about the way he's acted. You could hit back. But you mustn't do so. Now that does raise a question. Does that mean an abuser must be left free to continue his abuse? No. There's a place for action. There's a place for justice. The crucial issue is your attitude. Are you genuinely seeking to protect others? Are you truly concerned for godly justice? Or you really just wanting to get your own back? Christ didn't sin, didn't revile, didn't threaten, didn't respond in kind. How is it possible for Christ to act like that? How is it possible to refuse to retaliate, to refuse to threaten? And the answer lies in the fourth thing that Peter tells us. He committed his cause to God. He committed himself to him who judges righteously. And there are two aspects to that. When we read our translation, it suggests that that Christ committed himself to God. He put himself in God's hands. He trusted God to care for him. And we must do the same. To realize that nothing can really harm us. Yes, we may suffer many things. They may be extremely unpleasant. But if a wise and loving God is working out everything for our good, they won't ultimately damage us. Paul Tripp comments, most Christians want their service to God to result in a nice spouse and nice kids in a nice house in suburbia. But it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what God is doing. He's working on something much grander. While we focus on good results, God focuses on the process of making us good. We judge his faithfulness on the basis of how many of our desires he has met. But his intent is to free us from our bondage to sinful desires. We need to commit ourselves into God's keeping, as Christ committed himself to his Father. You hear that word from the cross, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. I leave myself in your keeping to deal with as you see fit. first aspect of it. When we look at the verse in our translation, we see that the word himself is in italics. It means it's not in the originals. In the original, what the translators have done is added it in the hope of making better sense. It wasn't just that Christ committed himself to his Father. He also committed his cause. He handed over the whole issue to God. You don't only entrust yourself to God, you entrust the oppressor to God as well. And you see that in many of the Psalms, as they appeal to God to act. Psalm 10, for example. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Arise, O Lord. O God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the humble. Why do the wicked renounce God? He has said in his heart, you will not require an account. But you have seen, for you observe trouble and grief to repay it by your hand. The helpless commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. That isn't vindictiveness. It's not a demand that God deal with my enemies because they're hurting me. It's a cry of faith, not pride. The cry of the weak one who entrusts himself to the strong. The hurting one who trusts the one who will make things better. See what Peter tells us to do here. Doesn't tell us express your anger, because that'll give you a therapeutic release. Doesn't say hold that anger in, suppress it. Rather he says continually, repeatedly commit the situation into God's hands. Know that God can be trusted. We can leave him to deal with things in his way, his time. We don't need to vindicate ourselves. That's often the problem, isn't it? We know it's unfair for us to suffer, to endure this injustice. We want everyone to know what we have to put up with. We want to be seen to be right. We're not willing to let God decide what happens, whether anyone will even know what we've been through. There's an interesting comment in John Calvin. For anyone to commit his cause to him who judges righteously, it's necessary that he should first put a check on himself, so that he doesn't ask anything inconsistent with the righteous judgment of God. Those who indulge themselves in looking for vengeance fail to concede to God his office of judge, but in a manner wish to make him an executioner. See the point he's making? Those who want to indulge in vengeance aren't letting God be judge. They're just wanting him to be the executioner. When you talk to God about it, are you appealing to him as the judge? Or have you already tried the case, decided on the appropriate sentence, and you just want God to execute the decision you've made? Maybe there's something else as well in this description. This word committed comes twice in Isaiah 53 in the Greek translation. Verse 6, the Lord has laid on him, committed to him the iniquity of us all. Verse 12, he bore the sin of men. The sin of men he was committed to him. Describes the Lord's surrender of himself to bear our sin. Christ's suffering is our example to follow. That's what he did. That's what we must do. It's also our motivation. What gives us the strength to act like this? It's a tremendous truth that Christ also suffered for us. Christ suffered for us. By choosing that word, he's focusing not just on the cross, but on the whole life of suffering that Christ endured for us. He perfectly obeyed God in the face of the most difficult opposition and hardship. And his obedience through unjust suffering leaves us an example to imitate. Example of the kind of life perfectly pleasing in God's sight. But then it's more than that. Christ himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. It's another quotation from Isaiah 53. By his stripes, his wounds, you were healed. And that healing could only come because Christ took our place. He was condemned instead of us. The intentional substitution, deliberate exchange. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. By his stripes we are healed. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The final verse of the chapter again alludes to Isaiah 53. It tells us what Christ has accomplished for us. You were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. The good shepherd is also the seeking shepherd, the one who brings us back to God, restores our relationship with him. Why did Christ suffer like this? Why did he die as our substitute? Why did he pay the penalty for our sin? Not just to save us from the consequences of sin, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness. He died to separate us from sin, that we might be utterly alienated from our sins. Well, if that was what Christ did, that was why he did that, how can we continue to respond to injustice in a sinful manner? To do that's to show contempt for what he has done. Whatever provocation you've endured, whatever injustice you've suffered, however badly you've been treated, you've not suffered the half of what he's been through. And he did it to take away from you that attitude of revenge, that critical spirit, that desire to retaliate. Christ intends us to live for righteousness, not only to abandon the sinful attitudes we used to have, to replace them with positive goodness. You know that saying, you can't fight something with nothing. It's not enough just to try, I'm not going to do that. You have to do something else instead. We replace those sinful attitudes, that desire for revenge, with a positive goodness. Peter returns to the subject in the next chapter. Finally, all of you, be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers. Be tender-hearted. Be courteous. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing. Knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. And that's love in action. Not having warm feelings about the oppressor. Not a sentimental glow inside. It's a determination, a settled determination to do him good. He's done you evil, but you don't repay evil with evil, but rather with good. It's a love that's motivated by considering the measure of God's love for us. The Father loved us so much that he gave his only Son for us. The Son loved us so much that he gave his life for us. How do we respond to unjust suffering? We follow the example of Christ. We don't sin. We don't retaliate. We don't threaten. We seek to bless those who've harmed us. We entrust ourselves and our cause to God, knowing that he is both the righteous judge and our loving Father. Also knowing that that's our calling. That's why Christ has suffered so much for us. This is how we glorify God. This is how we show a watching world that our God is real, that he does transform lives. God often wills believers to suffer for doing good. precisely so that through their humble and faithful endurance, others will be compelled to stop and take notice, and maybe ask, what is it about this God that he inspires that loyalty, that humility, to bear up under unjust suffering, shines a bright light on the grace of God, the glory of God, the wonder of our God. Well, may God help us to consider what he has done for us and to respond by praising him not only in our words but in our lives.